Okay, so you want to learn a language, but how exactly do you go about doing it? So there's a ton of different approaches all over the internet and in real life that try to sell you this way or that way to learn a language, or this method, or say things like, this is the only way to learn a language. If you learn any other way, you're doing it wrong, you're doing it badly. But that's not really the case. There are a lot of different ways to learn a language, but some ways may be better in certain contexts than in others. There's really a lot of correct ways to learn a language. In this video, I'm going to be giving you the tools you need to decide which language learning approach you should use, as well as giving you some of the pros and cons of each method, because depending on what you want at the end, you'll want to go about learning in different ways. Okay, so the first approach is just going to be the classic style of language learning. Just go grab a textbook and start studying straight out of it. Basically, this approach is for learning classic languages like Latin or Greek or whatever. This one doesn't really matter how you go about doing it. You just gotta go buy a textbook, start memorizing vocab, start learning grammar, all that stuff. You don't even need to worry about pronunciation or anything. You just need to put in the time to memorize the elements of language. This is also a good way to study an obscure language that you'll never end up speaking, or you'll never have the opportunity to speak. I've tried this approach for languages like Ket. It's a really cool language, but I'm most likely never gonna speak it. A drawback to this approach is you'll completely miss out on any potential fluency in your target language because you'll focus so heavily on grammar and ignore speaking and listening. So you'll have no communicative competency in the language, which is pretty important. To start in this approach, the number one thing you're going to want to do is just get a textbook, like I said earlier. But if you can't get a textbook, again, for a language like Ket, you're not going to be able to find a textbook anywhere. You're going to want to find some resources for that language that you can study. The resources that you're going to want to find are going to be vocab lists and grammar breakdowns. For really niche languages, there are resources on Google Scholar for just around any language. Not any language, but a lot of languages you'll be able to find on there. And if you can't find any resources for your language, but you really want to learn it, you'll have to follow the second approach. The second approach to language learning is called the silent method. This one's really cool. This is basically the first contact language learning strategy. You'll need to find someone who speaks your target language, and preferably who does not speak your language, and you don't speak their language. Once you've started interaction with this person, you're going to want to slowly point at objects and say what they are. So I'll point at my microphone and say microphone, microphone, microphone. Basically, you'll do this for a lot of objects, and hopefully the person you're talking to will get the hint and start pointing at a bunch of stuff and saying the word for it in their language. In doing this, you'll slowly build a base of concrete vocabulary. With this base, you can start adding grammar and pronunciation, slowly working up to fluency. It'll take a long time and it'll be a lot of work, but all other language learning methods take a long time and take a lot of work. However, the downside of this approach is that if the language is more mainstream, you won't be able to learn how to read and you won't be able to learn how to write in that language. So, for instance, this would be a really bad way to approach Chinese, but a pretty good way to approach an uncontacted tribe in the Amazon, or to approach a language such as Tobati, where there's almost no online resources for it. The third and final method for language learning is the most well-rounded approach. This method is supposed to be used in an academic language learning environment, such as at school or university, but oftentimes it's implemented somewhat poorly and reflects the first method a bit more than it should. Basically, for this method, you'll want to not just study on your own or just study with an instructor. Instead, you'll want to do a bit of both. This is most likely the best approach for most people because it prepares a learner to not only read and write in a language, but also to speak and comprehend that language. The easiest way to find this method is simply to sign up for a class at a college or in school. If you can't do that, you could try to find resources on Google Scholar and then find native speakers and kind of create your own curriculum by working through vocab and grammar and also speaking and listening with a real person. While this method is pretty good, when it becomes too much like the first method, it can impact how well you learn to speak a language, and then if it goes too far into the second approach, it could keep you from being able to properly read and write, which are both important. All these different methods and approaches are pretty good in their own right for teaching a language, but you can't learn a language from any of these different approaches if you neglect the fundamentals of language learning. The fundamentals are vocab practice, a lot of vocab practice. You can't understand a language if you don't even know the words. And pronunciation. You can't be understood if you can't pronounce the right words. Grammar is also important, but is not nearly as important as vocab and pronunciation. People often think grammar is much more important than it really is. So there you go, 3 different language learning methods for whatever situation you might find yourself in. 1, just learn because you think it's cool. 2, learn it just to speak it. And 3, combine the previous 2 to learn a language in a well-balanced way.